You mean the question if God is loving, why? Why does he allow suffering?
Yeah. Or not even suffering, but why does he allow bad things, whatever that might be?
Look, it depends where the person is at. What I mean by that is there are two levels to it. Like the question, as you say it now, if you're not suffering at this moment, you're not experiencing deep trauma in some way, then you would look at this question incredibly philosophically.
Yeah.
So you'd look at events in history. Why did that happen? Why did God allow that to happen?
So
But
like from a distance.
yes, so you can approach it philosophically, and that's fine. But for the majority of people, it's often related to something that they actually went through.
Yeah.
It's more traumatic. I mean, just an example, and there's so many examples. This happens every year in the church family, is we lose someone dies.
Yeah.
Last year for me, for example, it was my mother who died. And again, a lot of people have different stories, but for example, for us, it was about a 15-year journey of an illness, which you constantly pray to be lifted,
Yeah.
and that God would heal this person, and many people have prayed for this, and yet God hasn't answered it.
Yeah.
In fact, it's gotten worse until the end, and then she died,
Yeah.
and she died young, well, at least in modern terms, young.
Yeah.
And then at that stage, you don't really want to hear the question, if God is so loving, why did he allow this suffering to happen?
Yeah.
You just want to get through it.
Okay.
But it's later on when you get to the other side of it, a year later, or maybe even 6 months later, and you look back and then you start thinking, why?
Yeah.
Sometimes in the midst of suffering, you're calling that out, but you're not really interested in hearing answers.
Yeah. And they don't mean much to you when you're experiencing that pain and that suffering.
Yeah, so look, everyone at some point, I think this is the reality as well, at some point this question becomes relevant to you, because one person put it this way, we do live with the rumble of panic underneath everything. At one point, something's going to erupt, and the world as you know it will be ruined or changed forever because of suffering. And then you got to deal with it. The story that you had in your mind of what your world's going to be is gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the question comes actually, why did God change it? I had this story for myself. This is what I wanted to happen. This was my picture, my world, and it's gone now. Why did God do that?
Yeah.
And if he is so loving, why did he change the trajectory so severely?
Yeah. So, I mean, we already chatted before we were recording, and we said that there's actually no definitive answer to this, but I want to kind of break this down into two parts. So, in that question, if God is loving, so there's the first part, if God is loving, and here's the second part, why does he allow bad things to happen? So I think the Bible's quite clear, Carel, that God is loving. Yeah, we struggle with is that idea that a loving God could also punish. Psalm 145 verse 8. Do you want to read that?
I'm actually at Exodus 34 at the moment. Just what you were saying. I think the striking thing about that passage, and of course, ever since then, God reveals himself this way, is the fact this is the moment God reveals himself to Moses, my glory, because that's what he's asking for.
Yeah.
So the Lord, that's an emphasis, Yahweh, Yahweh. So who is Yahweh? Who is the God of Israel? And it's amazing to think that the first thing he says of himself is what you highlighted. Meaning that idea here, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness.
Yeah.
That's the first things God says about himself. And actually the rest of the redemptive story is God demonstrating the fact that this is who he is.
Yeah.
He is compassionate, he is patient, he is slow to anger, he is faithful. That's the rest of the story. But at the other part of the story, as you mentioned as well, he's a God of justice.
Yeah. And he judges wickedness.
Right, and that's also demonstrated throughout the story.
So here's the question. Does it mean then, if something bad happens to us, we're being punished or judged in that moment? Because I think some people think that,
Well, I think that's where it gets interesting, and that's why you need to keep following the story. Because if you read from here on in, you will see, for example, that the faithful also suffer.
Yeah, that's
so. For example,
exactly what I was thinking.
In the wilderness journey, just a little bit later on, the faithful are suffering as well.
Yeah,
Joshua
along with the baddies.
Joshua and Caleb have to walk for 40 years with the other people.
Yeah.
until that generation has been punished and it's finished. You have, for example, others like we're doing at the moment, the prophet Micah. Micah and Isaiah, they were there when the Assyrians were invading. They were in Jerusalem behind the walls while there was a siege. They were suffering as well.
Yeah.
So, and you see the same conflict in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation. At no point in the book of Revelation does it say that God's people will be spared suffering.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. In fact, we're promised in the New Testament that when we follow Christ, along with the blessings that we receive, we'll also receive persecution.
Yeah, and it's recognizing that life isn't always so clear. So that's where, for example, and I encourage you as you're watching this, is to go read from the Old Testament as we're journeying to Jesus, where it really gets clear. But if you look at Proverbs has that clear cut, the wisdom literature. Proverbs has that clear cut view of if you fear the Lord, you will be blessed.
Yeah.
You know,
obedience
your
equals
life
blessing.
will have relative success and blessing and so forth.
Yeah.
But if you don't fear the Lord, if you don't follow his ways, if you don't listen to his counsel, it leads to the opposite.
Curse.
So it's pretty clear cut. But then you get to a book like Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes keeps using the word meaningless, which actually means hevel, smoke, vapor. It's hard to see. It's hard to understand life.
Yeah.
It's really hard to even see the reason and rhyme, because there are righteous people or people who are faithful to God, and yet they are suffering.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go read church history, it's not like the church didn't suffer. Those who follow Jesus.
Yeah.
And it feels like hevel. And then just the last one is, I think, one of the most relevant books in the Bible, apart from the Gospels and looking at Jesus, is the book of Job.
Yeah.
Because here's a person who throughout that book is said to be righteous.
Yeah.
In fact, he was the most righteous person.
And that's why this bad stuff happened to him, actually, is to test his righteousness, isn't it?
Well, he doesn't know.
No, he doesn't know that.
If you read the book, you discover that Job lost everything and he has no idea why.
But we know as the reader.
Right, but for him it's hevel, it's smoke.
Yeah.
He can't see, why did God allow me to lose my children, my wealth, everything I have, my health, and he's in dust and ashes. And I think that's where you got to then go, but how does this work, God? Because you have described yourself as compassionate and kind and faithful and slow to anger. But you're just as well, and yet I'm following you and I'm suffering.
Yeah. There's something else I want to bring in here, Carel, because I think what we're saying, God is loving despite our suffering. But I think one of the big things, and correct me here if you think I'm wrong, but one of the big things is how we view suffering. Like as Western culture, we want to avoid it at all costs. We, in general, are in pursuit of comfort. We don't want our world shaken by the unwanted misery and suffering that certain circumstances bring. How would you say the Bible answers a question? If I came to you and I said, the reason I don't believe in God is because God should be loving and he should protect me from any type of suffering. And if he doesn't, then he's not really loving, or he doesn't even exist, maybe. I mean, how would you answer something like that?
Well, that's a loaded question.
Of course it's loaded.
Yeah.
And we're live, hey? So
I know, but let me try and unpick it in stages, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you talked about for people with a more Western orientation. I would argue from a more materialistic worldview. Basically, you only live once.
Yeah.
The fear of missing out. This is all you've got. So if that's your mindset, if you believe that the next 80 years, if you live that long or longer, is all you've got, then suffering would be something you'll try and avoid, because you're trying to make a little piece of heaven on earth.
Yeah.
And then suffering would be seen as an interruption, because what would be the purpose of suffering except to ruin the little bit of
life you got now?
Right, you only live once. And so, interesting enough, that's why what they found in a lot of studies is that actually people with a more materialistic worldview are often more traumatized by suffering.
Yeah.
Because they don't know how to deal with it. Because with materialism, you only live once, comes another way of looking at the world, which is called nihilism, which means there's no meaning or purpose. And so there's no meaning or purpose to suffering. So it just is, which is quite a harsh place to be.
Yeah.
So that's the one view. But the other view, which we find in other religions, is, I think we chatted about it before, is this idea of karma.
Yeah.
So some people would argue you suffer because it's a direct result of your actions.
So you actually deserve the suffering that comes, and you just accept it because
right.
it was your fault.
And in the process of reincarnation, you'll have a second shot.
Yeah.
So you are what you are because maybe you did something in your previous life, or you did something now and now you're suffering for it. And your hope is basically, well, let's try now to be the best person I can be so that I can get something else in the next life, if I can put it that way.
Because Buddhism kind of does the same thing. It sees pain and suffering as kind of an illusion. It's not real. And you can actually transcend it if you just work hard enough to meditate.
Yeah, that touches more the nihilism thing.
Yeah, exactly.
While Hinduism is more the karma thing.
Yes.
But Christianity is very different from all of those.
Yeah, it blows that out the water, but why?
So, again, going to the book of Job, and then let's go to the Gospels, if that's fine, to Jesus himself. And again, I have to say, as you're watching this video, there is no 100% airtight answer to this. And the last thing I want to do as we're discussing this is misrepresenting God.
Yeah, of course.
But a couple of things. So, interesting enough, the basic premise throughout the scriptures is, why does everything happen as it happens? Literally from creation to recreation, the coming of Jesus. The common answer throughout the whole Bible, the overarching answer of answers, is it's for His glory.
Yes.
Which means at the end of the day, or in the moment, we would see God's weightiness, His excellence displayed, and we would respond in turn with love and affection and worship.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. Or Romans 11 puts it this way: from Him, through Him, and to Him are all things. To Him be glory forever and ever. Amen. That's the heartbeat. That's the overarching answer. The struggle we have, so there's purpose, there's meaning in everything.
We just can't see it.
Which includes the bad things that are going on.
Yeah.
And that does not necessarily mean that doesn't function like karma. Although we have Proverbs, which says, if you walk in the fear of the Lord, your life will generally be blessed. Ecclesiastes and Job reveals to us that's not always the case.
Yeah.
That's not how it always works.
So there's a tension going on here.
And look, the greatest example of this, there are two actually. So one mirrors the other one, or one's the fullness of the other one. So in Genesis, you have the story of Joseph.
Yeah.
Who, you can imagine, he was betrayed and sold by his brothers into slavery. I mean, talk about a raw deal.
Then he was arrested for something he didn't do.
Exactly, put into jail. So in all intents and purposes, there's a series of unfortunate events happening to Joseph. And I can imagine at that stage, he would not understand why he's going through all these things. And yet at the end of it, God exalts him, and through his exaltation to be second in command, and through his wisdom that God has given him, he actually rescues people from a plague.
And he actually recognizes why he went through the hardship too, doesn't he, when he speaks to his brothers?
That's actually the conclusion of Genesis, when he says, you intended it for evil, but God turned it for good, if I can paraphrase.
Yeah.
And that's what's been happening throughout Genesis. You have these series of horrible events, and yet God constantly turning them for good.
Yeah.
And to accomplish His purposes, and again, for His glory. And then the ultimate display of that Joseph-like way, and even the book of Job, if you go read it and how it ends, is Jesus Himself.
Yep.
Because in history, and this is what we as Christians believe, the worst moment in history, the most evil moment in history, was actually when humanity rejected, falsely accused, condemned, and crucified God incarnate.
Yeah.
So this is something important to realize, is God went through our suffering. God the Son, in the person of Jesus.
Yeah.
So it's not like He's putting us in a place
that He hasn't been.
So
it's not like God doesn't understand how we feel when we suffer.
Right. So that's one of the things in Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, that he keeps bringing up. He knows what we're going through. He's empathetic.
Yeah.
But it's more than that. God didn't just go through that to empathize with us. But what you see at the cross, and this becomes the lens through which Christians understand suffering, is at that moment, which was the worst moment in history.
Yeah.
You can't think of a more evil moment.
Mm.
God turned evil and what people intended for evil upside down.
That's something amazing.
And upside down, since he turned it on itself and accomplished the greatest good. And the greatest good is the forgiveness of sins and basically the death of death in the death of Christ.
And not just for that moment while he was on the cross, but forever.
Exactly. And for the forgiveness of sins. And then he conquered over it.
Yep.
And so phenomenally, the worst moment in history is turned to accomplish the greatest good.
Mm. Mm.
And again, did God allow that to happen? Yes.
Yeah.
He did. Was it part of his purposes and plans and for his glory? Jesus says so himself, this is the hour when you'll be glorified.
Yeah.
You know, John 17.
Yeah.
And yet, that is also the hour when he suffers.
Yeah, the most.
And that's the hour when he accomplishes the greatest good.
Now, I know, Carel, you're not saying that when we suffer, it's kind of like a story like Jesus, like we're doing something amazing for God, we're bringing him great glory, and even in ourselves, we're like fulfilling some purpose. Are you saying that? Yes or no?
Well, not to the same extent. What I mean by that is we're not dying for people's sins or suffering for people's sins or conquering death. But interestingly enough, Paul in the letter to the Philippians says that through his suffering, he could know something of Christ's suffering.
Huh.
So there's a redemptive quality in knowing God
Yes.
through our suffering. And actually knowing Jesus through our suffering, we begin to understand in a more profound way what he went through when we suffer as well.
But you're not saying, because I know we spoke earlier, you're not saying we have to suffer in order to know God in that certain way.
No.
You're just saying that suffering can bring us to a place where we're more receptive of understanding what Christ did for us, like at a real level.
Yeah, but also, and I think also just recognizing that there's a redemptive quality as well. Because God is in control and because God can turn things upside down, and because he did it on the cross, that becomes my lens to understand my own suffering and to realize I don't understand like Job. For me, it's all smoke. Why I'm going through this.
So like with your mum,
right?
You haven't really got a definitive answer. You went through it.
Yeah.
But maybe one day, you talk about a redemptive quality. Are you talking about at one stage, when in heaven, you'll understand why you experienced that? Or
well, I think when we're in heaven, we don't care anymore because we have the fullness of what we're longing for. But what I'm trying to bring is we can trust that God is redeeming what's going on to accomplish his purposes, and it will be good.
Yeah.
It's the same with Job. Job never understood why he went through what he went through, and yet through it, God showed the heavenly host that Job really loves him for himself.
Yeah. So it's about faithfulness. I wonder, as we finish, if I could just share this story. And I highly recommend this book, Tim Keller's book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. This doesn't quite hit what you're saying, but I just thought it's something to...
But you don't... I just want to tell something as well after you.
Okay.
A story that might illustrate what we're getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This particular person was from the US, and they moved to South Africa and had a series of catastrophic events happen to them in their life. And actually, I found this kind of conclusion to her story quite amazing. She says this, we tend to see God's faithfulness as saving us from suffering. And yes, sometimes in his great mercy, he does save us from suffering. But that is not the mark of his faithfulness. As you were saying, Carel, we see in Scripture that many of those he loved deeply are also those who suffered greatly. And so I think we often think God's only faithful if we don't experience hardship in our lives. And I think what we've said tonight is that actually isn't the case. And I agree with that lady. Great book, by the way. Read it if you're going through any type of suffering and you want to understand more about God. But let's finish off with that story that you mentioned.
Look, I think it's recognizing, and hopefully this will illustrate it, we're part of God's grand plan. His overarching meta-narrative of history, accomplishing his purposes. He's given us glimmers of it. It's for His glory, it's to extend His kingdom, and of course, ultimately to conquer evil. He's given His answer towards evil, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the cross is there to demonstrate what He thinks of evil. But just an example of this, where maybe at this moment we have no understanding why we're going through what we're going through, but God has a purpose with it. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Moravians, the Moravian missionaries.
I know you love them. You've been to a couple of their churches, haven't you, in Elam and places like that?
Yeah, or Wuppertal that burned down.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't know the origins of the Moravians. They come actually from the old reformer, John Huss. I don't know if you've heard of John Huss before.
No.
This is before Luther's time, and he was a preacher.
Before my time as well.
Yeah, long before. He was in Bohemia, and during that period, of course, the story is well known that he was then arrested, falsely accused, burnt at the stake. But what a lot of people don't know is the followers of John Huss who listened to him about the gospel, they continued and they grew to a large group of people. But then in that period, there was the German Civil War.
Oh, yes.
Which claimed millions. And it basically eradicated almost what they're known as back then as the Bohemian Brethren. There was almost nothing of them left. And they basically were hiding. But then incredibly, of course, you can imagine if you were at that point in the German Civil War and what was going on, you'd be wondering, why is this happening?
Yeah.
And is there any good? Can any good come from this? Because it was carnage. But then incredibly, decades later, there was a young man called Count Zinzendorf, or Nikolaus Zinzendorf. He had a deep heart for missions, but he could never go to the mission field due to various reasons, which again for him, why hasn't God allowed me to go? Like life's turn of events hasn't allowed him. But he was a wealthy count, and then through a series of providential events, people from the Bohemian Brethren, those who were remaining, they were then known as the hidden seed, basically came to his estate and asked him, can we find asylum on your estate? And he invited them on, and then he created this little place called Herrenhut, Lord's Lodge or hut. And then phenomenally, he found the works of the former leaders of this movement. And then in his mind, he realized, wait a minute, why has God put these people in my place? If you look at their story, God must be wanting to do something through them. And eventually, they became what was known as the Moravian Church. And phenomenally, Count Zinzendorf and them together started the first major Protestant missionary movement. And they were the first missionaries to come to the shores of South Africa and actually share the gospel with the Khoisan. And for example, towns like Genadendal and Elim and Wuppertal are testimonies to their work.
And we still see their churches existing today.
Right, but think about it. When the suffering happened, those who were suffering had no idea how God was going to turn this upside down to accomplish something incredible.
Yeah.
And the reason there's a lot of missionaries today, especially from Protestant circles, is that was the beginnings of it. And so God turned something evil upside down. I guess the question for you and me in this time is, do we trust Him?
Yeah.
That what we are going through has a purpose.
Yeah.
It has meaning. And it will be for God's glory. And evil that we're observing in our world and in our lives personally will be turned upside down.
So that's the answer. Why does God, if He's loving, allow suffering or bad things to happen? Well, because actually He's going to turn it all upside down. One day we will see that, and we will experience that, and we will understand exactly why we experience bad things.
And look, it's recognizing that even at this moment you don't know why. According to the scriptures, Ecclesiastes, according to Job, according to others, it's really fine to wrestle with it. The Psalms invite us to wrestle with it.
Yeah.
But let's trust Him as well.
Guys, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next Sunday night.
Yeah, have a lovely evening.